Greetings all. I would like to know, is it possible to have any extra chairs brought in? They're coming. Awesome. For those of you in the back, chairs are coming. I am Ruth Huffbauer, the director of GDPE, and it gives me great pleasure to see all you wonderful GDPE members and friends here for our final distinguished ecologist of the semester, speaking today and tomorrow, so come back for more. And with that, I'm going to let Jill Barron introduce him.
This is a great crowd. So I am obviously not Pankaj Trivedi. He's teaching until 5 p.m., which is somehow a conflict with him having to come in, and he's hosting Peter Reich this week. So instead he asked me to do it, and it's a true honor to be able to do that. I can't say that I know Peter very well, but I was able to host him in 2014 at the John Wesley Powell Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, where he was involved in a working group, a very interesting working group on soil warming experiments and what we can do with them to advance our understanding of ecosystems. So Peter is the University of Minnesota Regents Professor. He's a distinguished McKnight University Professor. He's also the F.B. Hubachek Senior Chair in Forest Ecology and Tree Physiology at the University of Minnesota. But he's also, as of last October, been named Director of the University of Michigan Institute for Global Change Biology. The University of Global Change Biology was established in 2018 as a scientific research initiative and a synthesis center similar to the John Wesley Powell Center or CSINC or NCS, the National Center for Analysis and Synthesis. And it's designed to advance major new directions in transdisciplinary discovery in the sciences. So Peter didn't actually take on both of these jobs, well, he did, both at once, but that's because he gave up a position he held from 2011 to 2021, where he was chief scientist at the Hawkesbury Institute for the Environment at Western Sydney University in Australia. So he's a busy guy, as you all know. In Minnesota, he's a member of the Forest Ecology Research Group. He addresses questions of a fundamental nature, which he's going to do for us today, mostly related to understanding and stewarding nature. He works in a variety of ecosystems and topics, including social justice. He's been highly prolific in these fields, as you all are well aware. He provides foundational knowledge. It's universally used. He's published more than 230 papers, more than 20 of which have been cited more than 1,000 times. So he's also a member of the National Academy of Sciences in the US. He's also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He won an interesting Polish award with a Polish colleague, Jacek Oleksyn, who it's called the Plus Award, Polish United States Science Award. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences. He's a fellow of the Ecological Society of America. He won the BBVA Prize Laureate for knowledge in ecology and conservation and biology. Very interesting to us, Peter and his son, I think, launched a science education channel a few years ago called Minute Earth. It's had millions and millions of views, and if you haven't taken a look at it, you have to go see it on YouTube. Don't do it now. You're going to listen to a seminar. But these are insightful, easy to understand descriptions of science that everyone should like to know. So it's my great honor right now to introduce Peter Reich, and he's going to be talking to us on the challenges of being in ecology in the 21st century. So Peter?
Well, thanks very much for that kind introduction. Don't tell people in Michigan, but Australia is more fun than Michigan. It's also probably more fun than Minnesota, but the topic of my talk today, as you can see on the slide, is the challenges we all face as ecologists in the 21st century, in which, especially after the last 2 years and last 6 years, I often ask myself, this is fun what I do, but does it really matter? Does it make a difference to the world? Or am I just like spending my time on the planet having fun and being a nerd? And most of my time is spent looking at climate change, the pictures there, the way in which climate change impacts on natural and human systems. So the menu for today is I'm going to start with an even bigger picture context as an appetizer beyond climate change and other global change drivers I typically work on, and asking, do we dare look or do we dare not look? Then we'll get to the main event, which is more typical ecology. It's at least what I do. 3 stories from grasslands and 3 from forests about the way climate influences communities, how that matters with context, and what that might mean for carbon storage. And then if we have time, what I'm calling a digestif, where I'll ask a little bit more about whether we're asking the right questions, and if not, how might we do that? And the reason we might not get to it is I'd really like this to be a conversation rather than just me blathering. So if you have questions, thoughts, comments, please raise your hand. I'd much rather have it be interactive than me just blabbing up here for 45 or 50 minutes. So with that, I'll move on. And can you hear me when I walk around? I'm restless, so that'll be good. The first picture, the very first slide, is about the things we think about as ecologists in our day-to-day life, climate change and what it does. But there are a lot of other really massive problems facing the world, and that's just a handful of them that, every day when I get up, one or all of them come to mind. And then I go to work. It's like, well, I can't fix these things, but can I do work that's relevant to the problems we face in the world today? And the answer may not be yes, it might be no, but I think that's something we all grapple with in our work. And also, as I think about those problems, I approach it from white privilege and every other privilege. I've grown up with just one privilege after another, similar to many of the people who work in ecology, is evidenced by the 90 or 95% of the interns who've worked at our Biocon project over the years in Minnesota that you'll hear about today. And that's something else many of us, not everyone in this room, but many of us, have to think about is like, we've had all these advantages. What do we do with that? And again, it's a question I don't have an answer. Well, I do know that ecology is all about relationships. So we can think about, can we use ecology to ask questions about the things we think about in our day-to-day lives, climate change, forests, grasslands, agriculture. But maybe in the future we can also think about taking an ecological approach to these other big questions societies face. And that maybe that's how we need to train the next generation of scientists, is to be broader and think broader about this. So today, I'll ask whether I'm asking the right questions or whether we are collectively about relationships between the typical global environmental change we see, but also global challenges and things like biodiversity, ecosystems, and consequences for climate, nature, and people. And when I drill down to the ecology I do, are we asking questions in the right way at the right scales? But then maybe at the very end we can get back to this, like, well, what part of the broader sets of challenges we face globally is it our responsibility as scientists to try to meet in some fashion in our professional or personal lives? 60, 70 years ago, ecologists by and large didn't do that. Maybe we're still not doing it, but maybe we're starting to think about it. So what I'll mostly spend time talking about is the way in which my work uses thought experiments, field experiments, observations, and modeling to explore research that tries to understand impacts on forests and grasslands of global change, their composition, diversity, function, and fate in time and space, and a little bit about, if we get to it at the end, what I don't know about putting that knowledge to use to really try to save the planet. So as ecologists, what do we really need to know? What will happen to ecosystems? What will happen to climate? How will this influence people and nature? What should we do to tweak the dials to optimize that future? And how do we make that happen? Yeah, I think we know the answers to the first 3 or 4 much better than the 5th one. So I use this really simplistic cartoon to orient myself to the work. 98% of the work I've done in the last several decades. Think about the way in which CO2 and climate and other global changes influence plants and ecosystems, asking the question about whether ecosystems will retain their functional integrity under global change, and in turn, how those changes in the ecosystems feed back to influence the global carbon cycle and thus climate in this iterative loop. I'm also very interested, but don't do a lot of work, and some of you in the room may do a lot more, on the way global change influences not just natural ecosystems, but coupled human systems and people, and the way in which natural ecosystems and coupled human systems interact, and how those collectively influence climate change, both directly through impacts on the carbon cycle and through albedo and many other changes, emissions among the big one. So this is a bigger question that if I had another 30 years to work, I'd try to work across all of these spheres. The other thing I want to point out is that most of us as ecologists, we have the places we like to work. It might be a degraded system, but it's often a pretty forest or woodland or grassland that we work in. It's like our backyard, it's a small area. But what we really want to know is what's happening to the region, to the continent, to the globe. And how do we get there? How do we take our work at the scale of a plot the size of this room and have it relevant to what happens across the state of Colorado or the continent or the globe? That's something we still are all grappling with. Now, tomorrow I'm going to talk more about how we know what we do or what we think we know. In essence, thinking about mechanisms underpinning patterns and processes, things involving traits and trade-offs in ecological stoichiometry, multiple resource limitation theory, scaling theory. But today I'm going to focus more on some of the things we've learned without worrying too much about how we know it or how to explain it, and maybe a bit on what we don't know but would like to know, and some bigger picture things, even within ecology, where we think there's big knowledge gaps and none of us, including me, are really filling them. Now, I want to mention that the work I'm doing today is done in collaboration with many, many collaborators. This is just a subset of them in alphabetical order, and that I've been honored to work with so many people from so many parts of the world and learned a lot from all of them, and only been able to do the work I've done through the collaboration of all these teams. So getting to the three grassland stories, the first is asking about C3 versus C4 responsiveness to elevated CO2. It's an issue that's important in Colorado, among other places. The second is asking about diversity as a global change driver and CO2 and nitrogen effects on carbon storage. And the last is asking about the context dependency of global change effects. In essence, is response to any one global change contingent on one or two or three or four other global changes? And if so, how much or how little do we know about that? And I'll use a set of experiments we have had for many years to address these. And the take-home message here is that unexpected stuff has happened over the course of this 23-year experiment. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't have kept it going, although many times panelists and referees of our proposals say, oh, why do you keep doing the same experiment? But we actually do find new things all the time, including a really cool one that I'm not going to show today. And also uncertainty reigns. There's a lot about this that we still don't understand. But I'll couple that with a story about forests, where the take-home message is actually sometimes simple hypotheses do predict what we're going to see in the future. And here I'm going to talk about both when responses to warming are parallel among species and when they're different among species, both of which can enable simple predictions, and then collectively how those might drive biodiversity ecosystem function relationships in a way that's parallel to those seen in simple grassland experiments. Now, here's another cartoon I put together to help me think about the complexity here. It's like we've got CO2-associated changes in temperature and moisture. We've got land use changes, whether it's deforestation or agriculture. We've got wildfire. We've got insects, diseases, other things that all act through their various valves to impact the way in which grasslands and forests respond to those and how that differs with context, space, or time. And by context, I mean things like where in a species range you are, what kind of soil you're on, or what the land use history is. And then at the bottom is our fuzzy crystal ball where we're trying to use all that to predict what these systems are going to look like in the future. So the first part of this grassland story involves this long-term experiment called Biocon. We began it the prior millennia in 1998. It has CO2, 3 elevated and 3 ambient rings. It has an ambient and elevated nitrogen treatment, and it has plots with 1, 4, 9, or 16 perennial grassland species from 4 different functional groups. And there's 6 rings that look like that one ring there. Now, the first story is about this unexpected response in which we found over time that our typical hypothesis about C3 versus C4 grasses changed during the course of 2 decades. So, as I mentioned a minute ago, we have 4 different functional groups in our experiment, all perennial herbs or graminoids. and that they're expected to respond differently to elevated CO2, with the C3s being CO2 limited and the C4 grass being CO2 saturated and therefore unresponsive, in theory, to CO2. Now, this paradigm has been around for decades. Ellringer et al. Had a famous paper in 1997 making a nice diagram of where you would find C3 versus C4 winning as a function of temperature and CO2. So this paradigm is that C3 grasses are more positively responsive to elevated CO2 than C4s. Well, what's the evidence? Well, there are actually a couple of really well-cited reviews, one by Wand et al. And the other by Ainsworth and Long, one from Potts studies, the other from Face free air enrichment studies, that do show that the stimulation of above-ground biomass for C3 plants is 3 to 4 times greater than for C4 taxa. So all these studies support the paradigm. But most of these studies were 1 year, 2 years, 3 years at most. So does this hold in the long term? So we were able to address this using a subset of plots in our biocon experiment. We have 88 of our approximately 390 plots. They're 2 meter by 2 meter that were pure C3 or C4 grass, either monocultures of 8 species or mixtures where all 4 C3 or all 4 C4s were together. And the hypothesis is very simple, that stimulation of biomass by CO2 should occur and persist for C3 grasses, but be negligible for the C4 grasses. Well, what we actually found was that there was a positive response in the C3 grasses. This is total biomass under elevated ambient CO2 across years. And that we saw the opposite with the C4s. The C3s, we saw a positive response for the first 12 years or so. Then around 2010, that positive response disappeared. And in contrast, around 2009, the C4 grasses started to show a positive response to elevated CO2. We actually have all these species in 16 species mixtures as well. And in the 16 species mixtures, the C4 have become more more competitive and more abundant in those 16 species mixtures in the last 14 years as well. So we see it in the mixtures as well as the mono group plots. So this is, completely, we weren't smart enough to hypothesize this, but no one else in the world was either. And it suggests that, we shouldn't be too confident that we might do a great experiment for 3 or 4 years and think we have the answer. Nature is complicated, and lots of things happen. And 20 years is not very long, actually, for a grassland. What's going to happen in the next 20 years, 40 years? I have no idea, actually. So the responses were opposite of expectations after 10 years. And we should remember that the C3, C4 paradigm is one of the most convincing and best believed paradigms in all of ecology. And if that one doesn't hold, what about everything else that we think is true? So I'm going to spend 1 minute here talking about what might be driving this. We tested about 17 different possible hypotheses from the data we had. None of them that had anything to do with physiology seemed to hold at all, or with interannual variation in weather. The one thing that there seems to be some resonance with is feedbacks of CO2 on nitrogen cycling in the C3 versus C4 communities. In essence, we're asking whether nitrogen mineralization impacts of CO2 over time in these different communities have changed nitrogen availability. And we know from prior work in this experiment that the CO2 response is contingent on how much nitrogen is available. And actually, if we look at the data, it's pretty messy. But if you look at the CO2 effect on net nitrogen mineralization over the 20 years, the blue line is the C4 grasses. The red line is C3 grasses. The 0 means no effect. Above the line means nitrogen mineralization is enhanced, meaning there's more nitrogen available for plants. Below the 0 line means there's less. And you can see that the C3 and C4 grasses are going in opposite directions, and that this looks more or less like what we see for the effect on biomass. That again, over the same 20 years, the C4 grasses become positively responsive increasingly to elevated CO2, and the C3 grasses, that effect disappearing. So is this the explanation? Could be. We don't actually understand the mechanism, and we haven't taken the time or had the resources to try to figure out the way in which elevated CO2 is impacting soil communities, that would change nitrogen cycling in these two different groups. So that remains an open question. And I'll jump ahead now. The next of our grassland studies involves diversity as a global change driver, CO2 and nitrogen, which is what the experiment was set up to test, independent of all other factors. And here we're going to focus on carbon storage. We looked at many things over the years, but the question here is, as we lose diversity and as we have nitrogen deposition occurring over more than half the world and rising CO2 over the whole world, what are the impacts of this on carbon storage of this particular toy ecosystem? And so, we know that CO2 and nitrogen species richness influence net primary production, which changes the flow of carbon below ground and changes the microbial communities, which change what happens to the soil carbon, and that the net effect is basically whether the inputs or losses are greater. And don't look at the chart yet, look at the left side, which is, we had a paper last year led by one of our grad students, Melissa Pastor, in PNAS. What we looked at here is the relative effect size on ecosystem carbon. It's a percent change. It's carbon in plants and soils. Soil is about 85 or 90% of the total carbon. And the blue line above zero means carbon storage is increased. Red line means it's decreased. The take-home message is that all these factors influence carbon storage, but they did it in a way that varied over time, and they did it differently depending on the driver. And that species diversity increased ecosystem carbon, especially over time, much more than elevated CO2 or enriched nitrogen. The 1 to 4 species means how much more carbon was stored in plots that were 4 species rather than 1. 1 to 9 is comparing the 9 species plots to monocultures means, the 16 species to the monoculture means. So any increase in diversity increased the carbon storage, basically acquisition and holding onto that carbon, whereas CO2 actually, about 6 years into the study, was as big an effect as biodiversity. 6 years is a really long experiment by most ecological standards. I'd say longer than 98% of them. So if we'd stopped it then, we'd say, oh, CO2 and diversity have big effects on carbon storage. But for some reason, the CO2 effect has disappeared ever after that, whereas the diversity effect has gotten larger. Do we actually understand exactly why? No. We have lots and lots of data that we throw at this to try to make sense of it, and we kind of can, but I could spend the rest of the hour or the rest of the evening going over those without being able to convince you that we really know. But the data themselves, I think, speak for themselves in the sense that global change drivers do change carbon storage, but simple predictions probably are not going to hold up, at least not my simple predictions. So the last of the grassland stories is about what I'm calling context dependency, and that involves interactions among multiple global change factors. Now, a couple of years ago, there's a really nice paper in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution by a slew of authors, not 1,119, but 70, 80, 90, 100. Maybe someone in this room, actually, it wouldn't be surprising me. Anyone in this room? No, an author on it. And there were 1,100 or so experiments total that looked at carbon cycling responses to global change. But the vast majority of them were really short-term, simple experiments. There was one experiment that looked at 4 factors, precipitation, CO2, raising temperature by more than a degree, and enriched N. 2 experiments with 3 treatments, and experiments with 2 factors that went more than 3 years, are probably 10 or 15. So this 1,100 experiments is amazing. That's great. But it also suggests that we're going about our science in a very, very predictable and constrained way, where we do lots of studies that grad students can do in a year or 2, or we can do in a glass house or in a controlled environment chamber, or a field study that you get funding from an agency, but then that funding goes away. There's nothing wrong with those studies, but those aren't the only studies we should do, in my mind. So we managed in this Biocon experiment to set up a sub-experiment called Terracon, which stands for temperature, rainfall, and CO2 and nitrogen, which has a factorial of those 4, 2 by 2 by 2 by 2, in 48 of the plots within the 6 rings. This started in 2012. We raised we raised temperatures both below ground and above ground, like with a thermostat, by 2.5 degrees Celsius, tracking ambient temperature. and we also reduced summer rainfall by about 30%. The temperature treatments are very, very, very high tech. The rainfall treatment is very, very low tech, but they both work. So what do we see? Well, we had a paper in Nature Geoscience a couple of years ago. We looked at impacts on net primary production, which is both below ground root production and above ground. But the story is the same if we just looked above ground, or if we looked at soil flux, or if we looked at many other carbon cycling parameters. The impacts on productivity over 8 years, averaged across all levels of the other, was higher in warmed plots and in rich CO2 plots, a little bit less high, but higher in plus nitrogen, and 13% lower in reduced summer rain. So all these factors had an impact. But what was interesting to me was that the response to each factor was really quite contingent on levels of other factors, and here's 3 examples. So we've got NPP on the y-axis, might be hard to read. The 2 panels on the left are synergistic interactions, and the one on the right is an antagonistic interaction. We see that raising temperature by 2.5 degrees under ambient nitrogen conditions on this low nitrogen soil had very little effect on productivity. But if you add 4 grams N per meter squared per year, the warming effect was huge. So whether or not you had a positive or negative, but in this case positive effect of warming was really contingent on nitrogen supply. Similarly, the CO2 effect, as we've seen previously in the experiment, was contingent on nitrogen supply. That's the middle panel. We saw on the right that the response to reduced rainfall was quite large under ambient CO2. So if we were back in the ppm 340 era and you reduce rainfall by 30% at the site, you'd have a big negative effect. But the water savings effect of CO2 was sufficient enough, and or other effects of CO2, so we had very little negative effect of rainfall reduction under elevated CO2. Now, to me, the importance isn't any one of these interactions. It's the fact that we found lots and lots of interactions, and that we have very few ways of actually testing interactions, because observational studies are very hard to do that because many global change factors are varying in unison, and it's very hard to tease them apart in time or space. So here's a global map of all the experiments that manipulate temperature, rainfall, CO2, and nitrogen in perennial grasslands, in perennial vegetation, I mean. It's the experiment I just talked about. Now, in the perfect world, we'd have 80 such experiments, one in the Amazon forest, one in European pastures, one in forests in Finland, et cetera, because it really makes no sense to extrapolate from our little experiment to the entire world. And even with 80 experiments, we probably wouldn't have the full answer. But we don't fund those experiments because that's not the way our science happens. And it seems really expensive. I'd love to, someone give us $100 million or $500 million or $1 billion and set these experiments up. In other fields of science, money like that actually exists. But we either haven't asked for it or haven't asked for it in the right way over time. So we're left to use models to test these ideas, and there's nothing wrong with models, or the few small experiments that we have. So, we have this one small experiment, which is by our standards a big one with 6 rings and going for 20 years now, but we really want to know, how do you extrapolate to the world? I'm going to compare our results to 2 studies that are out there. One is a study led by Mark Hovenden, in which we threw together data from 19 experiments in grasslands, temperate grasslands around the world in 4 continents, to try to tease apart some of these contingencies. In this particular study, the most telling information was that rainfall seasonality, or the amount of rainfall in different seasons, mattered a lot. That for the same exact grassland, when rainfall was higher in the spring, those sites had increases in productivity due to CO2, that's on the left panel, and when rainfall in the non-spring, which is mostly summer, was high, the result was opposite. So that the seasonality of rainfall and the amount of rainfall in different times of year mattered a lot to these grasslands in terms of how they responded. So here we see, not only in the prior experiment, you see that responses to low rain matter when you look at other factors, but even how much rain you get in different times of years matter. And that's actually echoed in this other study by Xi et al. From Remote Sensing Environment in 2022. And I was talking to Chen actually an hour ago, and I'd totally forgotten about your paper, Alan, but it's very similar to your papers in the sense that the relative success of C4 grasses versus C3 grasses also depends on how much rain falls in the warm season versus the cool season. The results in this study from Australia were the opposite of yours with the same mechanism. In this case, C4 grasses became twice as abundant because more rain was falling in the warm season, whereas your result for the Dust Bowl area was the opposite. Because more rain was falling in the spring, C3 became more abundant. And so we need information like that about many, many different ways in which climate and other drivers change across the planet, across time, and not just for grasslands, but for forests and for agriculture and other systems. So it's a pretty complicated world out there, and I'm pretty humbled about trying to predict what these systems will look like in the future, which is kind of a really short summary of those 3 grassland studies. So now I'm going to jump to work we've been doing in a forest experiment in northern Minnesota, which is representative of the very edge of the southern boreal forest, and also talk a little bit about some forest biodiversity experiments called part of the IDENT family of tree diversity experiments in Quebec and in Minnesota, where we've planted species in different mixes, including 2 species plots that vary in functional diversity, and looked at what happened over time. So the B4 worm experiment is a climate change experiment in Minnesota's boreal forest at 2 sites, one near Duluth and the other up near the boundary waters. You can see the CFC and HWRC there. We warm below and above ground again for about 9 months a year since 2009 in this experiment. We also manipulate rainfall in open plots. We have plots both in the understory and in open. And we have 3 temperatures that over the last 6 or 7 years have been ambient, 1.6 and 3.1 degrees C. We've had 21 different species planted into native vegetation, herbaceous vegetation and shrubs over time. But the majority of them have been, we focused on 10 true boreal and 10 true temperate species over time that differ in their range, where they co-occur in northern Minnesota, but their southern range is either near that if they're boreal, or their northern range is near Minnesota if they're temperate species. A couple pictures of what these plots look like early in the experiment. This is one of the original 72 plots. Here's what it looks like when there was, in the fall where there was snow, and the warmer plots both stayed green and stayed snow-free. So the 3 stories here are about when species responses to warming in terms of respiratory metabolism and photosynthesis are parallel among species, enabling at least some degree of safety and extrapolating to ecosystem scale. And then we're going to talk about when responses to warming differ among species, yet still enable extrapolation because they make sense given the species range and how close to the range limits they are in our experiment. And that'll make more sense when I show it to you. And then collectively, how this information helps drive biodiversity, ecosystem function relationships that parallel those seen in grasslands. So the first mini story is that we looked at leaf level respiration over many years in many species, and we found that the metabolic acclimation dampens respiratory carbon loss to the atmosphere. So the 2 panels on the A side are response to 3.4 degrees experimental warming. The right side, it's 3.4 seasonal warming, so just a warm spell versus a cool spell. And if you just measure plants that have been not acclimated, you just raise their temperature by 3 degrees Fahrenheit, they increase about 22% in respiration instantaneously. But the acclimation, or the downregulation of their temperature responses to the temperature responses of the respiration, eliminate about 80% of that carbon loss. And that's similar in boreal temperate trees, and it was similar in response to our experimental warming as to seasonal variation, meaning making us feel that this is a pretty consistent response. So we see that some concern about runaway carbon loss from plant respiration, not necessarily soil respiration, isn't as bad as we might think it would be. It's still respiration to photosynthesis ratio goes up, but not nearly as much as you might worry about. The second story is about photosynthesis, and in this case, it's about the way photosynthesis is contingent on soil moisture in this particular system. So if we take all the dates in which we measured photosynthesis over about 5 different years, and we divide those into the percentiles from dry periods to moist periods. In essence, on the left is when volumetric water content is low, and on the far right, it's when that is highest. As soils dry, the warming impact on these species across all 10 species is that warming increases photosynthesis when the soils are wet, but it shifts to having a negative impact on photosynthesis when soils are dry. And the reason why is very simple. Plants are increasingly stomatal limited versus biochemically limited as soils dry. And so basically, it's a simple stomatal response that's shifting the same exact warming and the same exact plant from being positive during a wet spring to negative during a drier period 6 weeks later. And so this is a kind of simple and consistent response that gives us some confidence that maybe we can figure out what's happening to these systems. And actually, people have done global models of both response to VPD and soil moisture that are very similar to this and found similar patterns. Doesn't mean either one of them are right, but at least it's consistent. Now I'm going to shift to thinking about communities and individual species rather than aggregate properties of physiology. And here's like the most simplistic hypothesis of all time. You know, with warming, you expect species at a warm edge of range will do poorly because it's getting warmer and they're at their warmest margin. And in contrast, species at the cool end of range should thrive, all else being equal, if it gets warmer, and they should be able to perhaps move into the area that's now warmer than it was in the past. And that's our hypothesis about the set of species. And I'm just going to show you the results of our most recent experiment, a 5-year experiment. We planted in several thousand seedlings of 10 different species and looked at their survival, growth, and photosynthesis and other things over 5 years. We see that even 1.6 degrees Celsius is a tipping point for these species at the site, and that it's really contingent, and this is a kind of complicated graph, on where they are with respect to their range margin. So if you look at the zero, whoops, is this working? Yeah, there we go. The zero line, basically, everything to the right of that is where species, by being warmed, have been pushed to temperatures warmer than they experience it in their range. Whereas if to the left, the negative side on the x-axis of the zero, it means they're warmed, but they're still within their historic typical range. And what you see is that for growth and photosynthesis, if you're warmed, but you're still within your range, the warming actually increases your growth and photosynthesis. But that as you move to the right, down slope of the responses among the species in the 4 set of warming and rainfall manipulations, that when you are pushed outside of your range by warming, now the same amount of warming has negative impacts on your performance. So this whole notion, and when people think about climate envelope models, this suggests that to some degree those climate envelope models may actually hold water, because we see evidence here that when you're pushed outside of your range margin, you actually do function poorly. Now, survival is a little bit different. They all responded negatively to warming, but the response was much more negative when you were pushed further outside of your range margin. And these responses were seen both for 1.6 degree warming and 3.1. So we don't have to get out to 8 degree warming to see, big consequences for these systems. We're going to start to see it with pretty modest warming. And I'm not going to show you some of the evidence, but we think a lot of this is due to the fact that under warmer conditions, evapotranspiration is higher, soils dry faster, and it's really response to soils drying that's having the negative impact, not anything about being slightly warmer in a historically pretty cool part of the world. So is this a tipping point? We see that species such as spruce and fir survive and grow really poorly in these experiments when they're warmed at all. So the prognosis is they'll decline. Now you might have a positive lens on this and say, well, oaks and maples are actually growing better and having more photosynthesis when it's warmed, by and large. So maybe they'll do well. So the prognosis is favorable, but these species are present in very low numbers, only right near the range margin. So it's going to take them a long, long time to actually migrate and fill this range on their own, and even assisted migration we're not going to be able to move enough of these fast enough to help. And so we're going to see a period of time, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100 years, where the species that are historically the dominants are going to do poorly, and the species that might do well and replace them aren't going to be there yet. So the forests are probably not going to do very well. They're not going to acquire it, hold on to carbon. They're probably not going to be as good for timber production, for wildlife habitat, for recreation, and all those other things. Sorry to be a bummer, but that's what the data tend to show. And this will matter not just from the individual species standpoint, but also if we lose forest diversity, which we're losing much more in other parts of the world, such as the tropics, but we could lose it here. This will matter because when we run tree diversity experiments long enough for trees to interact the way grasslands individuals do within a year or two in experiments, we see that the effects of biodiversity are very similar, that when you have more diverse plots, you have over-yielding, which is what a value above 0 in terms of net diversity effect means here. If over-yielding of mixtures, that takes a while to show up, but it becomes increasingly strong, and you can't see the orange is complementarity and the blue is selection effect, and is due to the typical complementarity that we see in other experiments where species are either sharing light or soil resources in complementary ways over space or time, and other positive interactions as well. So, can we extrapolate from these little postage stamp plots out in the forest to the forests all over the world? Well, we can't, but we can at least compare our results to some other sets of studies using either models or remote sensing or other data. And here's one way we're doing it. We've been teamed up with Peter Thornton and Chris Huntingford and others using both the Joules model and the ELM, which used to be called ACME, which used to be a variant of CLM, using both somewhat different models. And when we incorporate not just the respiratory acclimation, but other ways in which respiration changes with temperature, and the way in which global respiratory trait data look when we actually look at them and incorporate them in the models, we see actually instead of respiration being reduced, it's increased by 30 to 40% in the models by having more biological realism in these models. Now, one thing we found fascinating is when we tried to publish both of these papers here, at first we got huge pushback from modelers because they basically said, oh, does the model better match the benchmarks? And our response was like, well, that's in some sense irrelevant because part of the underlying parameterization and logic of the model are just wrong. So we know these models, which have like 25,000 pages of code or some crazy thing, have ample opportunity for complementary mismatches that give you better matches with benchmark data but have imperfect logic in them. And so it was actually fascinating how long it took to get these papers accepted because of that pushback. In most cases, we showed they weren't worse than against the benchmarks, but they wanted improvements against the benchmarks rather than focusing on what we thought was the important part of these stories. The other story that I like to compare this to is a nice paper by Sula Menashe et al., and I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of that person's name. I don't know them, where they used satellite greening and browning data for the Canadian forest and put it in this Whittaker-esque diagram and looked at the trend direction, green meaning greening and brown meaning browning, which is pretty straightforward, and the size of the arrow was the magnitude of that change. And consistent with our data, we see that the big green arrows are in the cold northern parts of the boreal forest that are also pretty moist, where not surprisingly you get warmer temperatures, and which we've had historically over the last 30 years, and you're going to see greening, meaning, and this is net greening, so it's green for longer and there's more green. In contrast, the places where you see brown response, which is showing things are getting worse, are in the warmer, drier edges, similar to the southwest edge of the forest in northeastern Minnesota. And so completely different kind of data, but seems to be consistent in a story and consistent also with our very simplistic way about thinking about these systems. So in this case, simple thinking, at least over this time scales with these different kinds of data, does seem to hold up about what's happening. Now, we're ignoring so many other drivers in these systems. As it gets warmer, there's going to be more and more wildfire. There's more disease. There's more insects. Those all feed back with each other in terms of making these forests more sensitive to drying, but also more sensitive to fire and more sensitive to disease, which suggests that even the positive impacts are perhaps going to fade over time as it gets drier and drier, we get more fires. So whether those big green arrows will stay green 20 or 30 or 40 years from now is an open question. So I still have a little time then, especially since I started late. So I've kind of buzzed through these 3 grassland stories about climate and other global change drivers and what they mean for communities, context, and carbon, showing lots of ways in which I was not able or anyone else able to predict or even explain complicated things that happened. And then 3 stories about a specific forest experiment where pretty simplistic predictions seem to hold up pretty well and explain what's happening. Suggesting that, whether your hypotheses hold up in your study or don't, doesn't mean that they will in other studies in other places. And so, shouldn't be happy or unhappy, whichever it turns out. You should just put it in your thinking cap and try to think about what it really means for your system. I'm going to spend the last bit of time, though, talking about something even broader. It's like, are we asking the right questions as traditional ecologists or ecologists looking for the rest of the 21st century? And if not, how do we do this? And I certainly don't have the answers. I'm going to talk a little bit about something I started to do. And that's trying to look at some of these interactions between global change, ecosystems, and people in a full kind of life cycle analysis. And one way I started to do it was to ask questions about climate mitigation and climate justice. And this was really inspired after George Floyd was murdered, in our neighborhood, basically, in the Twin Cities, where, like a lot of people, you have to ask, what are we doing as a society? You can write papers, we can study how biodiversity matters in little ecosystem studies. Does that matter? What are we doing to the world? So I started thinking, well, I can't solve anything, but I certainly can't even understand scientifically all the ramifications of environmental justice. But I know a little bit about climate and carbon cycle and climate mitigation, so let's start reading about this. So I read hundreds of papers over that summer and last year or so. And there's lots and lots of literature on this, but they're mostly really granular. It's like, in a certain valley in Nepal, will this water impoundment be beneficial or, for carbon cycling and biodiversity and people's livelihood? But there was nothing I found that tried to pull this all together. So I foolishly have tried to do that, and we still haven't gotten it published yet, but we've been working on it for a couple of years. And one thing I tried to put together was what kind of data there is out there on things like well-being, life expectancy, GDP, both at country scale and within countries, and links to things like inequality, which can be measured in many ways, which is, if we think our field's controversial, you talk about trying to measure inequality, well, that's really hard. But anyway, I put a red box around ecosystems here because one of the things that I have been part of that's narrower than this larger initiative I'm showing here is a study that was part of an NC's working group that Forrest Isbell led, which was about biodiversity in multiple scales. Before I get to that, actually, as a preface to that, I've also was involved with Jingjing Liang from Purdue and Thomas Crowther starting something called the Global Forest Biodiversity Initiative, where we got scientists from around the world to bring inventory data together from various countries and from people's own data. And we've put those data together in a small number now of papers, but they allow us to ask questions we couldn't possibly ask if you only used the inventory data of one country. There are all sorts of issues with scientific culture and political culture and government culture because some countries don't allow their inventory data to be used in the way other countries do. So it's been a real learning experience. I was the second author in this paper with 140 authors. There was a lot of working with all the co-authors in a way that I normally have never seen. But anyway, we made an estimate of the number of tree species on Earth. This came out a couple months ago, which was really fun and interesting to do, and not just an exercise in coming up with a fun number. But if we're losing biodiversity on the Earth, doesn't it make sense to have some notion of what we have to start with? And so before we did this, actually, there was no even estimate other than just like scientists off the top of their head. The first paper that even tried to estimate the number of known species was just 5 years ago, where a group led by Beach et al., I think, put together data from various country-level list of species and came up with about 60,000. From this GFBI data, which has more than 40 million trees, we have 64,000 species that are known. And the fun part of this was actually using some statistics that other much more cleverer people than us thought up to try to estimate the number of unknown species from the known species. But I won't go into that any further here. I'm going to talk to some, I think, students tomorrow about that. So the other thing we did with this data set, and one of the other things, was we also looked at species richness at kilometer square grid cells across the whole world and made a map. Is that map accurate? Of course not, but it's a more accurate map, or maybe the first attempt to do something like this at a global scale. And the reason I bring those two things up is those help us with, those in a prior study where we used the global data to look at the global relationship between productivity and biodiversity in forests around the world, came up with a curve that looks exactly like the curve for global grasslands. And the theta that describes that curve is actually almost identical. But we put these data together on the number of tree species, where those tree species are, and what this means for biodiversity, productivity relationships. And in this working group, we tried to then look at the impact of forests on both nature and people. This is a paper led by Kiramori. It came out last year in Nature Climate Change, where we talked about this as a potential triple win for climate, biodiversity, and society, where if you ameliorated or mitigated climate change, that allowed more species to remain in tropical forests, which acquired and kept more carbon. And so if you do any one of those things, it helps with other things. Now, if you're looking at the glass half empty, you could also think about it as a triple negative, where loss of any of those has negative impacts, and that's actually the way we're going with biodiversity loss, climate change, and climate change, that you have negative feedbacks. But at least there's a possibility that you could inspire more preservation of biodiversity and mitigation of climate change because of the impacts it has both on people and the economy and biodiversity. So this is a kind of complicated graph from the paper where we looked at the mitigation boost via preserving biodiversity simply through mitigating climate change. So in essence, if there's less climate change, you lose less species, okay? And if you lose less species, you're gaining more carbon on this graph, and that the gains in carbon acquisition are highest in the countries that have the highest country-level social cost of carbon, meaning those countries are the most negatively impacted by climate change economically. So those countries, places like Brazil and Indonesia and many others, are places where they're going to face the biggest economic hits from climate change. They're also going to face the biggest biodiversity loss from climate change. They're also going to face the biggest climate change loss from losing biodiversity. So all these things play out. Now, this was a model. It has lots of assumptions in it. Do I believe that it accurately portrays all these? No. But at least it's an attempt to try to put together information to think about the ways we're changing the world through climate change, through the land use and biodiversity loss, might impact on each other and then impact on economics, which is something the rest of the world cares a lot about. And so I think we need to start, because in fact I think we will be saved from climate change, from the worst of climate change, by basically greed. That it's cheaper now to get energy from solar and from wind, and although politics gets in the way of that, eventually we will stop most of climate change simply because people can make more money doing it. Now, that's maybe a cynical route to a positive end, but that's really the way I think the world works. And actually, maybe I think I'll stop there. I'll show this one last graph before I go to the very end, which is then we tried to look at, in this larger paper that I've been working on, the way in which a number of mitigation factors, including various things having to do with technology and carbon emissions, not just natural solutions, but here I'm showing the graph that carbon storage in plants and soils and the way we might enhance that has both negative and positive impacts on various aspects of climate justice, although in total it has a very positive impact. But it's not positive everywhere, it's not positive for everyone. So those kind of complications are what makes it complicated to think about, we're going to plant more diverse forests, more diverse grasslands, because those lands are used for many other things, and there's always winners and losers in that. So maybe the take-home message, sorry about that, take-home message from the talk is, I think we actually are, as ecologists, asking good questions, the right questions, but maybe not enough of them, maybe not comprehensively enough in enough context, not sufficiently over time and space. And to some extent, that's our fault for maybe not trying, but it's also the fault of the larger society for not funding it. But we certainly could try to, we're smart, we should figure out how to do it without that funding. And also not sufficiently from a coupled, whoops, missing a D there, human natural systems framework. Now, there are people in many, many departments in this university and others, whether they're in anthropology or the business school or school of sustainability or ecology or engineering, who actually are working on this. And so I'm optimistic from the fact that there are people doing this, but we need to do more of it. It needs to become part of what we do in ecology as well as in business school and the engineering school. And I don't think we're quite there yet. It's kind of like some people do it, it's kind of off to the side. But in the business school, we're just going to worry about business. We were talking about that an hour ago, Alan, right? That, that the coming freight train coming out of the tunnel head on at us, it doesn't really actually enter into their calculations of what they should study and do and work on and how they should manage the systems that they manage, whether it's economics or transport or others. And I think it's partly our job, and this is my own biased view, that we as ecologists need to reach out and try to help people in other areas realize that. But we also have to do it ourselves. I think, did I talk to you about that, Alan? I gave a talk a few years ago at a prestigious university with a room full of ecology and evolutionary biologists, and I asked them, just for conversation, like, how many of you know what the CO2 concentration was? And half of them did not know what the atmospheric CO2 concentration was. It blew my mind that these are, people in the National Academy of Science, evolutionary biologists, who didn't know that number. Now, maybe you could say that doesn't matter. They still were, thinking climate change was bad. But just the fact that this has not become important in the way we even do evolution and ecology training at universities is pretty crazy. And maybe that's one reason I decided to take on this dual job at the University of Michigan, to try to push that there, because they're no better than anywhere else in the terms of educating the entire population of students and staff and faculty about global environmental change and what that means, not just for nematodes and my favorite tree species, but for people all over the planet. So with that, I'll stop. I'll get off my soapbox, and happy to entertain questions or comments. Thanks.
So when you look at these big shifts, whether it's biodiversity or increased yields or so forth, do you couple that with changes in molecular soil chemistry? You increase nitrogen, you increase CO2, you increase temperature, a lot of changes in the molecular chemistry in the soil, and also the microbiome change. Do you try to explain some of these observations by chemistry and microbiology?
Yes, I do that by collaborating with people who know how to do that. But we are, and other people in various teams around the world are trying to do that as well, to understand, and especially being funded by agencies such as DOE, to come up with better models by better understanding the general principles, so you don't just have to take an empirical relationship and put it into a model. You can try to incorporate mechanistic understanding. But we're still a long way away, given that these interactions are very complicated. But that is what people are trying to do.
Thank you.
Jill.
So last week was Earth Week, such as it is, and people were saying Happy Earth Week, and it was very strange. But the White House put out an announcement that they're going to start a routinely recurring natural assessment of our natural lands and waters, similar to what the Heinz Center did many, many years ago. They're now going to do this as a government function. And the second part of that is that they're going to set up natural capital accounting, where they're going to try to quantify in dollars and cents the value of our natural resources. And I'm just wondering what you think of that.
I think it's great. And I think that I mean, the science is hard because we know putting dollars on ecosystem services is not easy, but it's certainly not zero, which is what we count it as now. Something that's good, but then we have to do something about that. And so, and also we may not have the same government in 6 months or 2 years. And so, you know, so I think we need to do that, but we need to do more. And I think that, and I think we'll get there. We're not going to get there as fast as we should, but I think we will get there. Just like, I mean, maybe it's a terrible analogy, but before gay marriage became legal, and 2, 3, 4 years before that, we all thought, oh, this won't happen for 20, 30, 40 years. You know, if anything, they were going to put it in the Constitution that it was illegal. At least in our state constitution, we actually had a ballot initiative on it, and it failed. But then there was a tipping point, and public opinion changed. Maybe I'm being naively optimistic, but I think younger people, enough of them, think differently about the world, and maybe they'll vote, and they'll vote differently, both politically, but with their purchases and where they live and how they go about their lives, so that we do make a difference. I mean, if we don't have optimism, then, you know, we might as well just go and jump off the nearest mountain.
I'm going to hand this over to Bucky in just a second, who has a question. I forgot to thank Sojas, who is co-hosting Peter's visit. So I wanted to do that first. Thank you very much, Sojas.
Thank you, Sojas. I was just curious on your opinion of whether or not long-term ecological research stations like the FACE experiments you had could be applied to urban systems. Just because there's been long-term ecological research stations set up in a lot of cities, especially in the United States and parts of Europe, but there hasn't, at least to my knowledge, been any atmospheric manipulation in areas to see what happens to maybe does this increase ozone formation, like those kinds of things, to changes in the biogeochemical cycle. Have you either seen any literature of people trying to do that, or do you think that's even possible in urban settings?
Well, it's possible, but whether that's the best approach might, because your questions are different in urban areas that are so dynamic in what happens over time. Maybe not through the LTR, or maybe through it, but there are atmospheric scientists all around the world who study emissions within cities spatially and try to understand everything from pollution to pollen to carbon cycling, methane cycling, and other cycling, and impacts on heat and heat wave effects. So I think people are looking at this, and you can use found experiments, and maybe in some cases what I'm calling a found experiment, maybe you compare a heat wave in a place where there's trees versus one where there's not, or a heat wave in a cold place versus a warm place, to try to get at these, and that maybe those are as good or better than some of these kind of global change experiments in a very, very heterogeneous landscape. I mean, an urban area, maybe it's no more heterogeneous than a forest, and I just think it is, but in my mind I think of it as really heterogeneous, and so it'd be hard put to think, how would I set up a FACE study in an urban area that made sense other than that one specific place? But it's a great question, is what we do in cities in terms of learning about them. But also I think I would argue that for many things we're looking about, what we should worry about in cities is what happens to the people there, because the footprint of cities, unless you consider their conceptual footprint, but the actual land the city is on, actually has a pretty small effect on most global cycles compared to the larger landscape, because it just doesn't cover that much of the Earth. And so again, it depends on what your question is. But I think that we certainly, like from a climate justice standpoint, of course, cities are a great place, or an important place to study this, because that's a place, well, not the only place, but a place where huge injustices happen because of the fact that certain people see more flooding and more heat waves and et cetera, more pollution, et cetera. So, not sure I actually answered your question, but.
Well, I mean, it's just a really odd question, because I can't imagine a way that you would set that up either. So I was just curious if you had thought about that, or you someone who's thinking about that, and what your position is on.
So you were talking about how these long-term experiments can be very expensive to fund, right, especially globally. And then you talked about how you could maybe look outside of traditional funding frameworks to go about doing that, what do you think are some first steps to looking outside of those traditional frameworks for funding?
We need to become friends with the people who have the money. I mean, that's because by being friends rather than enemies with them, then we have a chance to say, oh, you have $80 billion, you know, spending $1 billion of that on research, and it could be our research, it could be research about health, it could be on anything, but that's something that's science, actually might speak to them then. And now, if you don't have an audience with them, and I don't have an audience with them, you don't have any approach. So somehow you need to reach the people who can reach those people. And some of it's happening organically in the sense that some people have a lot of money, there's a lot of philanthropy, and a lot of it has gone to education and other things, but I think more of it will go in this realm in the future. But how we as a scientific society figure out how to reach those people is something, maybe it's at the level of scientific societies. I don't know whether the scientific societies try to do that, but it's a good question. But I think there is actually a lot of money there. But having said that, the federal government is huge. Even the richest people on earth don't have very much money compared to the federal government. So the federal government could fund all this stuff very, very easily.
One last question, and then we have a reception, and we can keep asking questions after in the reception and tomorrow.
Hi, Peter. I'm curious about how much of elevated carbon CO2 to cause how many of the carbon storages, and how many of carbon storage is gonna change the climate justice. Have you ever calculated that?
Could you rephrase that or say it again? I don't quite follow.
How much of elevated CO2 gonna cause how many of carbon storages in ecosystem?
So you're asking whether elevated CO2 does change carbon storage?
Yeah.
Or are you asking does it increase it?
Yeah, have you ever calculated the...
Okay, and then the second part was what?
How many of this carbon storage gonna change the climate justice?
Okay, so in essence, what we do know from reverse engineering the math, that the oceans and lands have scrubbed out almost half of the CO2 we've put in the atmosphere in the last 200 years, or however many years, which is a huge, what's the dollar sign on that ecosystem service? Quadrillions of dollars, probably? I mean, it's just huge. So we know the oceans and land have done that. Part of it is due to rise in CO2. Part of it might, obviously it's due to the fact that there's more CO2 in the air, and so more of it's being sequestered. But whether or not we're going to see more and more of that in the future is what many of these land surface models are really all about, is trying to figure out whether or not the land and ocean carbon sinks will be larger or smaller in the future. And they actually, and I'll show this tomorrow, they disagree, even though these models are actually very similar in all of their parameterization logic, they disagree a lot because there's subtle interactions in the models. So I don't think we know the answer to that question. I think there still is sequestration going on because CO2 levels aren't increasing as much as emissions. So again, we can do the math and we see that it's still happening. Hints that it's declining. And yes, it's to the extent that anything that causes more climate change is going to negatively impact poorer people and people who have less resources and less ability, then the fact that the land and the oceans are storing carbon is helping with ameliorate climate injustice by the very fact that it's slowing down climate change. So, but the real question is, can we help? Can we do anything to the land? And we can, or theoretically, by not cutting forests and not cutting peatlands and by increasing land carbon storage. But whether we will is a very different question. So.
Great, thanks. I saw another question over there. Sorry about that. Catch Peter in the reception. Let's thank Peter, and I have drink tickets for everybody who wants them.